Ben, welcome to the Freedom Pact podcast.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks so much for reaching out. Always happy to have a new audience.
It's an absolute pleasure to have you. And I want to start off, let's try and define things before we jump into it. So you say that insulin resistance itself won't kill you, but it will lead towards diseases that will. In fact, you say that insulin resistance is connected to almost every chronic disease. So, like I said, let's make sure we define everything in the simplest way
Yeah.
for our audience who might be completely new to this. So let's start right at the start. Could you first describe what insulin is and what it does for the body?
Yeah. So insulin is a hormone, and there are, of course, countless hormones flowing through the blood at any moment. And this is a hormone it's created in one little spot of the body in the pancreas, and then it flows through the blood and has an effect on literally every single cell. So every cell in the body will respond to insulin in one way or another. Now, typically or conventionally, we look at the effects of insulin almost totally through the lens of what it does to glucose. Because we eat a starchy, sugary meal, glucose will climb. That is not healthy for the glucose to stay elevated. So insulin comes in as the hero, and insulin will be released from the pancreas. And one of its jobs, although for most people they think of this as insulin's only job, but insulin will open the doors in muscle and fat cells in particular, allowing the glucose to come rushing from the blood into those cells until the blood glucose levels come back down. So that's insulin's main or most famous job. But the truth is, insulin does things all over the body. It tells every cell to do something. And the theme of all of that from every cell in the body is that insulin tells the cell what to do with energy, what to do with nutrients, what to do with glucose and amino acids and fatty acids, and what to do with ketones and lactate, all these molecules that can be used for energy. Insulin will tell the cell what to do, and generally it's store energy and build things. Take in these molecules and build something bigger from them. So that's the thematic effects of insulin throughout the body. But of course, again, the most famous is what insulin does to glucose.
Hmm. So, what is meant exactly by insulin resistance, and what is happening in the body when that is occurring?
Yeah, so that's a relevant question because of how prevalent insulin resistance is and how relevant it is in, as you noted earlier, in virtually every chronic disease. So I very much contend that everyone ought to know what this problem is, and that's kind of my professional mission in a way. So insulin resistance is two things. Um, One is the compromised insulin signaling itself. And by that, I mean some cells of the body aren't responding as well as they were before to the hormone insulin. So they are insulin resistant. That's the insulin resistance part of it. But mind you, not all of the cells are compromised. Many of the body's cells continue to respond to insulin as perfectly as they ever did. That becomes a problem in light of the second pillar of insulin resistance. So the first is the altered insulin signaling itself, or insulin resistance. The second is the hyperinsulinemia, or the chronically elevated insulin. In the body, when the body is in insulin resistance, blood insulin levels are several times higher than they used to be. Well, that's nothing to the cells that are actually insulin resistant because they've become deaf to that signal anyway. So cranking up the volume isn't going to bother them. However, as I noted, the cells that are still very sensitive to insulin, now they are inundated with this dramatically elevated insulin. So now the insulin is forcing these cells to do more than they would have wanted to do ideally. So again, insulin resistance is two things. One, it's altered insulin signaling at different cells of the body, and two, chronically elevated insulin called hyperinsulinemia.
So I think everyone listening to this can almost hear how passionate you are about this. I think your passion's almost jumping through the screen when you talk about it. Whenever I've heard you talk about it, what is it that's made you dedicate such a large portion of your life to this specifically?
Yeah, insulin resistance appears to be the great mediator between fat tissue and disease. Or maybe I'll get even more specific between fat cells and disease. In the very beginning of my master's degree, I just became increasingly fascinated by fat cells. And it was because I had stumbled across one single manuscript that outlined how fat cells produced pro-inflammatory proteins and produced hormones. And that to me was a total revelation. I only thought of the fat cells up until that point as just storage depots. Something to take in the excess energy when it's available, and something to let that energy go when the body needs it. And mind you, that's a fascinating role in itself. But learning that the fat cells were having these systemic effects, that they could tell distant cells of the body to do things and to behave differently, that was fascinating. And insulin resistance is the connection. If you have fat cells that are making the body sick, it's in almost every instance, but not every instance, it's generally going to be because of what it's doing to insulin resistance.
So I think everyone listening right now is probably thinking, I pray to God, this isn't me. What are some of the indicators that somebody may be insulin resistant?
Yeah. So there are several that we could go through. In fact, I'll mention a few, but at its simplest, I would say if a person is fatter around their middle than they know they should be, and that may be a little vague. So in fact, let me get a little more specific. If they are able to measure their waist to hip ratio, so they measure with a measuring tape the largest part around their belly, then the largest part around their buttocks or hips area. If that waist divided by hip number is over 0.8 for men or around 0.9 for women, then that's a bit of a red flag. That's a bit of a warning. But alone, we would say that's not going to be enough. But I would say if someone has that, they're chubbier than they know they should be, and they have elevated blood pressure, almost guaranteed that person has insulin resistance. Now, we could take it a little further. If they have a family history, if they have an immediate relative with type 2 diabetes, they are at a higher risk. If the man has erectile dysfunction, that could be one of the earliest symptoms of insulin resistance, even in men in their 20s. If a woman has polycystic ovary syndrome, PCOS, which is the most common infertility in women, that is almost totally a disease of insulin resistance. And then maybe on the most obvious end, in some people, if a person has skin tags, then they're very likely insulin resistant. And skin tags are little kind of stalks of skin, or like a little pillar, a teeny little column of skin. And it's just these little bumps that people will get around their armpits or around their neck typically. And those are a very strong sign of insulin resistance. So any of those things and a handful more, those would be something for someone to be paying attention to in themselves or in a loved one, in order to gauge where they are at on that spectrum of insulin resistance versus insulin sensitive.
So I think a big thing when it comes to any health issue, people start to assume, yeah, this may be a problem, but it's very unlikely that it's affecting me. Everyone just they turn the blind eye and just rather not know. But how common is it for someone to be insulin resistant? And are there any particular groups that it tends to trend in more than others?
Yeah, so insulin resistance is very likely the single most common health problem in the world. By way of non-infectious problems. I know that's a very bold statement, and the raw statistics on confirming insulin resistance, which is also known as prediabetes, would suggest that a little under half of adults in the Western world, and to be honest, it's at least as bad, if not worse, throughout the Middle East and much of Asia, China and India included, are actually potentially worse, especially India, than the rates we have here in the US. So it's very, very common. The problem with those statistics that would seek to confirm insulin resistance is that many people have it and they don't know. And that's me sort of getting into a different topic, but it's so often undiagnosed or it's misdiagnosed. Someone simply knows that they have hypertension, or they have infertility, or they have fatty liver disease. and they wouldn't have received a diagnosis of insulin resistance, although it is almost certainly going to be the cause of that problem. The reason insulin resistance is undiagnosed so often is that we don't look at insulin. Insulin has continued to be playing sort of second fiddle to glucose. So when we look at insulin resistance, we almost only ever view it as early on the spectrum towards type 2 diabetes. That isn't wrong. Insulin resistance is absolutely the foundation of type 2 diabetes. You cannot have type 2 diabetes without insulin resistance. It is simply insulin resistance that has progressed so bad that the glucose has changed. But in fact, let me elaborate briefly. So here we have insulin and we have glucose, these two clinical values that I would say need to be viewed to understand insulin resistance in type 2 diabetes. What's happening over the years in this individual is that they're becoming progressively insulin resistant, and the insulin is several times higher and climbing every year, but the glucose is staying normal. And because we don't look at insulin, we have a glucose-centric paradigm of these things, we miss the insulin entirely. And then it's only when the body has become so resistant to its insulin, even though it's swimming in a sea of insulin, now the glucose starts to climb, well, then we detect the problem. Unfortunately, it was 20 years perhaps, or even longer later. If we, by looking at the glucose, we miss the problem until it's a very big problem. And we could have detected the problem decades earlier, potentially, if we had been looking at the insulin. But we don't. Insulin has just never managed to kind of break through to that elite level of being measured on every single blood test. We will measure, whether it's in the UK or North America or anywhere else, we always measure glucose, we always measure lipids, and that is sometimes the end of it. We never measure insulin. It's just not become part of the conversation. And that's why I'm on the rooftop screaming this, because I believe that once we can shift that paradigm away from glucose, not that glucose doesn't have value clinically, it certainly does, but it really pales in comparison to the value that insulin has. So the sooner we can pivot and look at insulin, we can not only detect problems sooner, we can treat them better. Because, for example, back to that paradigm I was describing, in type 2 diabetes, insulin is up and now glucose is up. Because we only care about the glucose, the average clinician is going to say, well, you know what, let's just give you more insulin. Let's just put you on insulin therapy. Now we've pushed their insulin to super physiological levels, and it works to bring the glucose down. But if this truly were just a glucose problem, then everything would get better. And yet, in that situation of giving a type 2 diabetic insulin, everything gets worse. They get fatter, and they get sicker, and they die faster. It's because it's an insulin problem, not a glucose problem.
It's like you mentioned. I was going to say, do you think that insulin resistance sort of goes hand in hand with the rising obesity epidemic that we seem to be facing in the world?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for sure. In fact, you don't even have to get to obesity. What's so interesting, you'd asked me about earlier, and I failed to address it, about different groups of people that may have greater concerns with regards to insulin resistance. It really is a matter of how fat can you get and stay healthy with that fat. And I like to joke, and I hope it's never offensive, that if you want to be fat, then you want to be Caucasian or European, Northern European descent, because Caucasians appear to be able to get fatter than other ethnicities and stay healthier. And on the other side of this, you have someone of, say, Chinese, Asian ethnicity or Asian Indian ethnicity who has a very low, they tend to have a much lower threshold of how much fat that body can hold before they start to get sick. So, for example, I was doing my fellowship in Singapore, this beautiful country, former British colony, so it's English speaking, has British law carryover, which means it's a wonderful country, and I mean that in all sincerity. As someone who was born in Canada and now living in the US, there's something to be said for the British Empire. So nevertheless, Singapore had an express interest in studying metabolic disorders across ethnicities, because the differences are so striking, where you can take a Caucasian, Northern European fellow, and you have a Chinese Singaporean. Both of these Singaporean guys, but different ethnicities, they start to get fat, and the Chinese ethnicity will start to suffer from that body fat at remarkably low body fat levels.
Wow.
The Caucasian is looking at the Chinese guy thinking, well, you're maybe the slightest bit chubby, but nothing, and yet that Chinese ethnicity is starting to get hypertension, type 2 diabetes, fatty liver disease. And the Asian guy who's just as chubby, or sorry, the Caucasian European man, he's doing fine because his threshold for storing fat is so much higher on average. There are, of course, differences within every ethnicity, of course, but on average, that those ethnicities are going to really experience the consequences of fat gain very, very differently, to the point that Asian ethnicities in general need to be, their body fatness needs to be held to a different gauge or a different metric, because the traditional BMI measurements that would work, say, with a Caucasian or African ethnicity, it doesn't hold up for Asian ethnicities because they start to suffer from the consequences of that fatness much, much sooner.
Yeah, I was going to say something like BMI, that's sort of
Yep.
this universally used rule of thumb. It seems too generalized to be applicable to anyone.
That's right. Yeah, it just starts to fall apart across the ethnicities and the inherent differences between them.
Now, you cite a number of lifestyle factors that can contribute to insulin resistance. I'd like to talk about a few of those. One that I'm particularly conscious about at the moment, after reading a few books on the subject, is you mentioned sleep. What role can sleep play in insulin? That came as quite a surprise to me.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful effect, isn't it? It's actually one, I appreciate that you're pointing it out, because it's one that's a little discouraging for me, as I've struggled with sleep for years. And to this day, I'm a terrible sleeper, even when I engage in perfect habits. So that's one that's close to my heart. Even one bad night of sleep can result in demonstrable insulin resistance the next day. Now, that's not to say that it's permanent, not at all. Get a good night and everything's gone. But the problem becomes that as you have one bad night after another, although I'm now extrapolating from the available data a little bit, but it's not hard to imagine that as you continue to have one bad night after another, what was originally an acute problem with insulin resistance now becomes a genuine chronic problem that starts feeding itself. So what mediates these two things, sleep deprivation or poor sleeping with insulin resistance, is the stress hormones. If you sleep poorly, a human will have higher levels of cortisol and epinephrine. Those are the stress hormones, and sleep deprivation is a stress. It might not seem like a stress in a conventional situation, that you're trying to run away from a bear, which is of course not conventional at all, or you're experiencing a great deal of stress through work or home obligations. No, sleep deprivation is a unique stress, but it still plays into those same two stress hormones, those prototypical hormones, epinephrine, or also known as adrenaline, and cortisol. Now, those do mediate the body's response to stress. What they have in common also is that they are both what's called insulin antagonists. They make the body a little insulin resistant, because those two stress hormones, among their many, many actions, they are trying to increase blood glucose, because they want your body to be ready for an excitement to do something, to act, to get out of that stressful situation. Of course, there's no running away from poor sleep, so it doesn't work. It's our own stress response kind of working against us in that case. But nevertheless, that's how we're hardwired. And so those stress hormones are trying to push the glucose up. That means insulin, which is trying to push the glucose down, has to continue to work harder and harder and harder. And we're pitting these two signals against each other. These stress hormones trying to increase glucose, insulin trying to push it back down. And in this case of sleep deprivation, the stress signal and the insulin resistance wins that battle.
Oh, that's really, especially for myself, I struggle with sleep, like you mentioned, so that does quite hit home a bit. Another one that hit home for me is, obviously I'm British. I drink a lot of tea. Now, I tried to take sugar out of the equation a long time ago. I started using sweeteners. I drink quite a few cups of tea a day. I have quite a lot of sweeteners. You mentioned sweeteners. What effect do they have on this?
Yeah. What a great question. I'm thrilled you brought that up, because it's such a topic of interest. In general, sweeteners are just fine. In general, it's a pretty safe bet that across the broad class of sweeteners, whatever the sweetener is, in general, it's going to be just fine, and there's no reason to worry about it. In fact, I could almost end it there, but I'll elaborate a little more. But although the sort of diminishing returns, I'd say someone could just take that point and take that and listen to nothing else over the next minute. I am more of an advocate of the natural sweeteners like stevia and monk fruit than I am the others. But even something like even something as broad as aspartame, which is in every diet soda, there's no evidence really to suggest that's a problem. And so in general, the sweetener itself is fine. However, a note of caution is that there is something unnatural, and I don't mean wrong, but there's something unnatural about tasting something sweet and not having glucose levels go up. That's the way it would work in nature, because anything that would taste sweet in nature would have carbohydrates. There's no exception. It's not a protein, it's not a fat, it's a carbohydrate that tastes sweet. Now, of course, not all carbohydrates, but if it is something sweet, it would have come with glucose. And so the body is primed to be ready for that glucose. So in some instances, there are reports that you taste something sweet and you get a little bit of an insulin spike. I would say that's less of a problem. The bigger problem is that your body, your brain feels this sweetness, it senses this sweetness, and it starts to drive you to want to eat the carbohydrates that should have come with that sweetness. So you're sitting there drinking that diet soda or that sweetened tea with an artificial sweetener, or even a natural non-caloric sweetener, and then afterwards, in the following hours, perhaps the cravings start to mount, where now all of a sudden you're thinking, oh, geez, I wasn't going to have any biscuits or bread or toast with this, but now I just have to. I just have to. Whereas you might have been able to resist that temptation more easily without that sweet sensation. Now, all of that is very much a sort of relative area, because I know many people that can taste a sweetener and have no temptation. They can drink that diet soda or that tea or that coffee and be perfectly content and put it down and be done. But I also know people who will eat that something sweet and it just lights up a part of their brain that they're kind of biting their knuckle for the next few hours, doing everything they can to resist the increasing cravings, driving them to want to eat something they know they shouldn't. That would be my only point of caution with sweeteners. In general, I think sweeteners are perfectly fine as long as the person knows they can handle it without then spilling into other behavior that they know they shouldn't.
So the only negative effects there, I would imagine, completely outweigh the effects of something like sugar. I mean, we've had a lot of guys from the nutrition space on the show, like Dr. Neil Barnard, Frank Lipman. They all talk about sugar as if it's this devil. Well, what is your relationship like with sugar?
Yeah. So I think sugar is something that we eat far too much of, and it has no real nutritional value. I will, however, say that our bodies at least know what to do with it. That we have all the, and I'll elaborate more on that in just a second, I guess, because that might sound a bit strange. We know how to metabolize sugar. Our bodies are well adapted to this. I say that only in contrast to something like soybean oil, where our ancestors 1,000 years ago were eating honey, and honey is sugar based. It is nature's sugar, a mix of glucose and fructose, very much like sugar is. Not even 100 years ago, no one was eating soybean oil and canola oil and corn oil. So these seed oils, and I don't mean to really shift the topic into that, but I view the biggest changes and the biggest problem with the modern human diet is the excessive consumption of refined carbohydrates and refined oils. If I had to pick, I would say the refined oils are perhaps more pathological in the long term, simply because we are ill adapted to eating those oils. That amount of those types of fats is totally new in the human diet. And mind you, so too, of course, is the amount of refined starches and sugars we're eating, but we at least know how to metabolize those. It's not healthy, and it'll certainly start contributing to disease including insulin resistance, and both of them will. But sugar is terrible. I think someone could cut it out and live a significantly healthier life than ever eating it. But sugar is also delicious. It's wonderful. It's so fun to be able to enjoy. So I would never try to impose that kind of restriction in my home. Frankly, just because I wouldn't want to deprive my family of the fun that comes from eating treats from time to time. But my challenge then as the adult and the dad is to make sure that it is a treat when we have it. It is not a daily occurrence.
One thing I'd love to get your take on is different diet approaches, because it's a topic I ask. People might be sick of me asking by now, but I want to find the information. There's a lot of debate in terms of different diet approaches. There's maybe the Mediterranean, then on one end of the spectrum, you have the vegan approach. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the carnivore approach. There's paleo, there's keto, there's all these different diet types. Have you noticed any correlations between a specific diet type and insulin resistance?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Well, I will just say, at the risk of offending a significant number of people, I am vehemently opposed to veganism
Wow.
in every way, shape, or form. So I'll make that incredibly clear up front. I think that it is completely antithetical to human development and human survival. We are not herbivores by any objective measurement. Now, I know that when it comes to veganism, it's not scientific. It's more in the realm of almost kind of a religious zeal, where the fervor that comes with someone being vegan. And I don't mean for that to sound offensive, actually. I truly don't. In some instances, someone's doing it because they feel it's more of a moral situation. I will, to kind of dispel that idea a little bit, and to speak completely as a scientist, and a life scientist at that, a cell biologist. Everything that is living because it benefits from something that died. Now, I say that because perhaps the moral vegan is going to say, well, I'm not going to eat animal foods because I don't want to contribute to killing that animal. Well, that is wrong thinking, because everything that we eat is something that was alive and we've killed it. Even growing plants, anyway, it doesn't matter what it is we're eating. We are alive because we're benefiting from something that died, plant or animal. So it's just, you pick what you're going to do. But even that, beside the point, there are fats that are essential to humans that you cannot get from plants. There are amino acids that are essential to humans that you'd have a very hard time getting from plants, that you get very easily from animals. And there are different, so there are different other nutrients so that you would be absent in. So to be vegan, and then I promise I'll stop talking about that. It is a privilege of the elite. You have to be educated enough to know what you're deficient in, because you will be deficient in nutrients. There's no question. Absolutely, you will be. And you have to be wealthy enough to afford the high quality supplements to make up for it. So I don't think a vegan diet is a sustainable or even practical diet for a human. Now, to me, the best nutritional policies are as follows: 3 ideas. 1, control carbohydrates. So make sure that you're focusing on the less refined carbohydrates. Focus mostly on fruits and vegetables, and then put grains and anything else, especially if it comes in a bag or a box with a barcode, put them much, much further back in the diet. So focus on fruits and vegetables. So that's control carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are what will spike insulin the most. And the frequent spiking of insulin is one of the main drivers of insulin resistance. You want to keep insulin down. So, and controlling carbohydrates is a very good way to do that. And then the next 2 ideas kind of come together. Make sure you're getting enough protein. So I say prioritize protein, and don't fear fat. We have a very strong cultural fear of fat, where we've been told for decades that it's terrible and we should avoid it at all costs. And I think that is absolutely asinine advice. I think it is wrong on every level. And the clinical studies back me up, frankly. Otherwise, I wouldn't be an advocate of it. So protein, the best proteins, to kind of elaborate on these 2 points a little more, are animal proteins. That is objectively the case. And I know it's very popular nowadays to have plant proteins, and they simply don't work as well. Plant proteins don't have the complement of amino acids that animal proteins do. We don't absorb them as well from plant sources. And part of that could be that plant proteins have things called anti-nutrients. That almost sounds like the stuff of myth, but it is absolutely, these are real molecules, tannins, phytic acids, trypsin inhibitors that come with these refined plant proteins that will physically inhibit our intestine's ability to digest those proteins. And another knock against plant protein, in addition to the fact that they're very refined artificial proteins, is that they don't come with fat. Protein is supposed to come with fat. And by that, I mean, in nature, the best proteins do come with fat, egg, dairy, and meat. And fat helps protein digest better. So with those animal proteins, not only are you getting better amino acids, but you're actually getting them. You're actually getting them from your guts into your blood where you need them to be, because the fat helps those protein digestive enzymes work better. And that's very likely why fat and protein together are more anabolic. They actually build muscle better than protein alone. So anytime someone's just focusing on protein, I would just want to be that little whisper in their ear saying, but are you getting fat with that protein as well? Because you should. It makes it all work better. So to me, those are the three dietary strategies based on each of the three macronutrients. And I evaluate them the way I do for multiple reasons. Carbohydrates, I think, need to be controlled because they have the greatest spike of insulin, whereas protein and fat have very little or no effect on insulin. And dietary carbohydrates are not essential to humans in any degree. We have zero biological need for dietary carbohydrates. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't eat any and that we should all go carnivore. I'm not saying that. But you could. Every one of us could do that, and we'd be perfectly healthy. It would be an adjustment. But all that we need in the human diet is there are essential amino acids, there are essential fatty acids. That is protein and fat. There's nothing essential about dietary carbohydrates. Even the most dogmatic dietitian would have to reluctantly disclose that fact. There's nothing essential about dietary carbohydrates. But again, I'm not saying we should eliminate them from the diet. Not at all. They can be healthy and they can be certainly enjoyed, but we shouldn't build our diet on the one macronutrient that we don't need and that coincidentally has the biggest effect on insulin. But unfortunately, that's how we do it. We've been told to eat high carbohydrate, low fat diets. And I look at that and just think, well, why? First of all, where's the evidence to suggest this? But why would we base our diet on the one macronutrient that we don't have an actual biological need for? It's crazy to me.
Yeah. We've mentioned a lot of the physical side, the physical effects on the body, but one thing that I think is becoming a popular topic, especially in the health space in podcasts at the moment, is dementia or the mental effects. And everyone's worried about one day when they grow up suffering from Alzheimer's. I think we've all seen the effects that it has. Is there a link between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease?
Yeah. In fact, I love that you're bringing that up. That's one of the main motivations for me to adhere to the diet that I do, which basically is the points that I just mentioned. Because of my fear of Alzheimer's disease and seeing my grandma go through that, it terrifies me. So yes, in fact, I'm alluding to that connection already. Yes, Alzheimer's disease is very intimately connected to insulin resistance. In fact, people refer to it, actual Alzheimer's scientists refer to it as insulin resistance of the brain, or they'll say that it's kind of a unique type of diabetes, and they'll call it type 3 diabetes. I don't agree with that latter classification. It's simply insulin resistance. I'd mentioned earlier how insulin will control the movement of glucose into some cells. Well, the brain, to some degree, depends on insulin to stimulate that glucose uptake. And as the brain starts to become insulin resistant, the brain's need for glucose is up here, but now as it becomes insulin resistant, it creates this energetic gap where glucose can't fill all of the energetic need of the brain. And so now the brain is left with this energetic deficit, wondering, well, I'm starving, I can't get all the energy that I need, and the brain does have a high energy demand. And so in order to just continue to survive, the brain's going to have to turn down its functions. And that would be manifest as some degree of cognitive decline. Now, to make this very relevant, we are just about to publish. We've already had it accepted for publication. We're just doing the final editing before it gets formally published. This manuscript where we explored the expression of metabolic genes in human brain samples. So these are post-mortem samples of people who died without Alzheimer's disease and compared that with people who died with confirmed Alzheimer's disease. And we looked at the expression of genes involved in glucose metabolism and ketone metabolism in 4 distinct areas of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus and a couple others. We found that almost every gene involved in glucose metabolism, from the taking in of the glucose and the breaking down of the glucose, was significantly down in the Alzheimer's brains compared to the normal brains. However, the genes involved in ketone metabolism, there were, I think, a couple that were down, but otherwise they were totally normal across both sets of these brains. So in Alzheimer's disease, there is in fact a quantifiable, you can measure this, reduction in the degree to which the brain takes in and metabolizes glucose, even before Alzheimer's, in early cognitive decline. So much of the problem with Alzheimer's, as much as we have focused on plaques for decades, these brain plaques disrupting the brain, that has just not held up under intense scrutiny. What is still a viable theory is that Alzheimer's disease, as happens with, mind you, with other neurological problems like migraines and epilepsy, it's really a problem of energy, where it's an energy deficit of the brain. And as I said, the evidence just continues to support that idea. So, and then again, to bring it back to insulin resistance, insulin tells the brain, like it does every cell, what to do with energy. And if insulin isn't working well, then the brain just doesn't know what to do. The body is swimming in a sea of glucose in these instances, and yet the brain feels like it can't get enough to drink.
Wow. So I think everyone at this point listening who's made it this far, they probably sat up right now. Their mind's probably thinking, right, I want to go to work on this. So for those people, as we start to wind down now, if we could give them some practical takeaways that they could start doing today, things they can start being conscious about today, what practical things would you recommend for them to do, to start being conscious of?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. I would say change breakfast tomorrow. Overnight, as someone has been sleeping, insulin has slowly been coming down, which is a wonderful thing. I am totally convinced that the key to a healthy, long life is keeping insulin low as much as possible. Not that it's a villain. It'll come up sometimes, and it should, but we need to keep it as low as possible, as much as possible. So as overnight, insulin has been coming down, and then in the morning, tragically, as so often happens everywhere in the world, this is not just a Western problem, breakfast is based on a starchy, sugary meal. You know, it's a bagel and sweetened coffee. It's 2 bowls of cereal and a glass of orange juice. Basically, it's pure garbage. It will spike up insulin, it'll spike up glucose. And so the average person wakes up, insulin has finally come down, and it's been down for a few hours, helping the body be a little more insulin sensitive, activating some fat burning, and then we turn it all off, and we slam down on the fat burning, we spike up the insulin, and then unfortunately, by starting the morning that way, it basically sets the person up to fail the rest of the day, because 2 or 3 hours later, the insulin and the glucose start coming down, and the person senses this hunger, even though there's no reason they should be hungry, and they have to do it again, and they do it again, and they do it again. And so they're spending every waking moment in a state of elevated insulin. And that is a wonderful way to get fat and sick. Wow. So change breakfast tomorrow. Follow those 3 rules: control carbs, prioritize protein, fill with fat. And if you're going to eat, follow those rules, or alternatively, fast through breakfast. That's almost always what I do. I'll drink a cup of yerba mate, like a tea. I'll drink a cup of tea, and I'll be making breakfast for my children, and I'll certainly allow more liberties for my children, but I always make breakfast. That's just sort of the dynamic in the home. And so this morning I made these kind of lower carb, higher protein and fat waffles. And I let them have as much butter as they wanted. They could use syrup. I don't mind. These are little growing kids. I want them to enjoy the waffles. And we were talking as they were eating breakfast, and we're just busy in the mornings, and I'm just sipping my cup of tea. Now I will have a big lunch, and I will follow those 3 rules again. And then later today, I'll have dinner with my family. And my rule on dinner is I will eat dinner with my family. Now, my wife tends to look at nutrition similarly as I do, so it's rarely that dinner is going to be very unhealthy. But regardless, I will eat dinner with my family. And then that gets me to maybe my second rule. So the first rule is control breakfast tomorrow. And then my second rule would be when dinner is over, stop eating. Be done. In fact, relevant to what we were talking about earlier, the single most helpful thing I have ever done to improve my sleeping is not eating within about 3 hours or so before I go to bed, more if I can do it. Going to bed on a full stomach is a wonderful way to make sure that you sleep miserably. It absolutely will. It'll make you hotter. Your stomach will be bothering you. Your heart rate will be higher this entire time while your body is working very hard to digest when it wants to be sleeping and slowing things down. Having a full stomach won't let you do that. So change breakfast tomorrow or fast through it entirely, but that would still be changing it. And then second, stop eating after dinner. Don't snack. For me, that's when my cravings are the worst. I confess. I will have club soda or sparkling water with ice, and I will just put in some apple cider vinegar. It's very tart, and it just is a nice thing I can sort of be sipping on in the evening, helping the kids with homework or getting them to bed, and then watching a show or whatever it may be. So have a strategy to help get through that evening, which is when most people have the most cravings.
Fantastic advice and practicality. I love it. The question that we always end on with every guest. Now, the answer to this, it could be anything. It could be your research. It could be your family. It could be anything. But for you right now, for Ben Bikman, what makes a life worth living?
Yeah, what a great question. For me, it is to, as you touched on, it is to remember what matters most. And I will say no success I have as a scientist and professor will make up for a failure to meet my obligations to my family. So the secret for me to a good life is making sure that my family comes first, always giving my wife and children the best of my efforts. And remember that anything else I'm doing is really, it should be a way to help me be a better family man.
Beautiful, man. I got goosebumps when you said that. It's a beautiful answer.
Ah, good,
Look,
good.
thank you so much for coming on the show today. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope you have too.
Oh, I sure have. Yeah, thanks so much for reaching out. I think that anyone listening would have come away edified, having learned something they didn't know before. That's the hope, at least.
Amazing. And just before we go, where can everyone find you online, find the book and whatnot?
Yeah. So thanks again. The name of the book is Why We Get Sick. It's available anywhere books are sold. And it's kind of just goes into a lot of what we were talking about. What is insulin resistance? Why does it matter? And what to do about it. And again, I hope I've given people the impression that it matters more than you think. It touches on almost any chronic disease. It's very surprising. I'm fairly busy on social media, Instagram especially, and that's Ben Bikman, PhD. And also, I regularly contribute to blog posts on a site called Get Health, HLTH, and people can learn more about a meal replacement shake that I've helped design with a couple of my brothers at that same website, Get Health, HLTH.com.
Amazing. I'll leave all those links in the description below. Ben, thanks again, my man.
My pleasure. This was great.